Hello, fellow writers! I hope you are all doing great. It is November and it is workshop application season, or very shortly about to be workshop application season. I thought it would be a good time to film something about workshops, writing workshops, and in particular, those kinds of workshops where you have to audition to get in and that are residencies, meaning that you go away somewhere for some amount of time to partake in the workshop. If that sounds interesting to you, stick around. This video is going to be 10 things to ask yourself before you apply to a residency writing workshop. But before we get to those 10 things, I want to first define what I mean and then give you kind of a general idea of what happens at these workshops so you have a better idea and you can better gauge whether a workshop like this is right for you, and also maybe go into a little bit of the pros and cons of some of these workshops from my perspective. So let's define what we're talking about first. When I say a residency writing workshop, I mean a workshop where you have to apply to get in. There is a limited amount of classroom space reserved for students, so they only take a few applicants per cycle, and they require you to go live at the workshop. So examples of this are things like Viable Paradise, Clarion, Clarion West, Taos Toolbox, that's what it's called, Taos Toolbox. Why is that so hard to say? The ones that I'm most familiar with are in the SFF, or the speculative fiction space, but of course they exist in all kinds of genres. And I believe that most of what I discuss here will be largely relevant across different genres of writing workshops. Although I have to caveat that, of course, my knowledge and my area is in SFF specifically. So let me give you a little bit of background so you can understand the context of my perspective. I went to Clarion in 2017, and I also worked as a workshop assistant for the virtual class of Clarion West this year in 2021. I have also talked to a lot of people who have attended other workshops like Tao's Toolbox and Viable Paradise, and I've done a lot of research. Before I applied to Clarion, I did a ton of research into what kind of workshop it was, and I talked to a bunch of people, and I read a lot of blog posts, and you can do that too, by the way. There are lots of people who've written about their experiences, and that'll give you a more varied picture than the one that I may present to you today, because after all, I'm just one person and this is just my perspective. I also want to just put it out there that although many of these workshops are treated under a similar umbrella and people think about applying to several of them at the same time, they're each unique. And I don't mean just in terms of their structure, because there are differences in how they structure the lessons and what sorts of content they focus in. For example, Tao's Toolbox is exclusively for novels, and you have to have written a full novel before you even go, because it is a novel revision focused workshop. Whereas Clarion and Clarion West, for example, and I believe Viable Paradise as well, are short story focused, and they want you to generate and write new short stories while you're at the workshop. Structurally, too, they can be quite different in terms of length of time. For example, Viable Paradise is, I believe, 1 week. Clarion and Clarion West are 6 weeks over the summer. There's often a difference in proportion of instruction time versus workshop time versus free time. Because you're usually working during that time, you're writing or you're reading other people's work. In addition to structural differences, each of these workshops has a different flavor or tone or culture, right? They are run by different kinds of people. They have a different set of, not values exactly, because I think if you lined up their value statements, they would all be similar, but let's just say different feelings and approaches. And that's the kind of thing that's hard to discern from just the workshop website. That's the kind of thing you have to hunt down people who went to those workshops and talk about. So here's generally how these workshops tend to go down. There is an application period. Usually the applications cost money to apply, like college applications. So that's just a cost that you're going to have to plan for. Many of these workshops do have scholarships available, and I encourage you to look into them. They usually start closing up the application period in February, March, April, so on. It sort of depends. So you apply, and then you wait, and you wait, and you wait, and you wait, and you wait. And then you hear back, and chances are you will get rejected. That's just the numbers, it's statistics. But if you do get in, then there comes a period of online orientation where you are connected to the program coordinator team, and they help you get oriented and figure out how you're going to get there and what you're going to do. They might send you materials to prepare ahead of time. Often, too, this is your chance to meet some of the other members of your cohort virtually. When I went to Clarion, what we had was a WordPress blog where we each made a blog post about ourselves and kind of introduced ourselves to each other that way. It was very simple, but it was nice getting a sense of each person. If the program has living facilities that are organized so that you need suite mates or roommates, this is also the time when you might fill out a survey so that they can assign you to a roommate or suite mate. And then also this is a great chance to ask any questions that you might have about procedures, what to expect, what to get ready. Also, we had a big, I think, email thread. Were we still on email or did we have a Slack? I can't remember. I think we were all on email still, but we traded tips about what to bring and who's bringing what, and we organized stuff like, oh, I've got an electric tea kettle I can bring, and things like that, because we were going to be living away from home for 6 weeks and I need an electric tea kettle if I'm going to do that. And then the exciting day comes, the first day. Usually there is an orientation period. They give you a tour. The program coordinators talk you through some of the procedures, get a whole bunch of handouts covering things like code of conduct, what to do if there's an emergency, things like that, procedural things. And then you have your first instructor. For a multi-week program, you have several instructors, and then that's it. You go to the class, you go to workshop, you write, you learn, you bond with your cohort until it's all over. There's often an exit survey that you fill out at that point. And I think Clarion West does one every week, or at least they did when I was working for them. So in addition to all the formal instruction, there are often optional fun events featuring guests or community members. So for example, in Seattle, there's a lot of writers that live in and around the Seattle area. So they might host book signings or little talks or just fun meetups. In San Diego, we had a weekly reading which drew people from the community. The instructor for that week would host a reading at the bookstore. A bunch of us would go. I would say almost always we all went. And also community members would go too. So alums who lived nearby, or other writers, or friends of the writer. So it was fun, it was bonding, and it was also a little bit of networking. Also, San Diego Comic-Con happens to coincide with the Clarion in San Diego, so we would get tickets to San Diego Comic-Con and be able to go. And also because of Comic-Con, there might be people in town who would drop by and see us. The Clarion conference organizers also arranged a number of Zoom meetings for us for video conferencing with agents and editors and publishers. And that was really great too. These were very informal, just Q&A sessions. So let's quickly go to the pros and cons, many of which you've probably already figured out. Let's start with the cons. It's super expensive, and it's expensive not just in money, but in time. Viable Paradise is probably the most friendly in that respect because they are 1 week. So all you have to do, I mean, you still have to travel there and get there and have a week off of your life, but it's a week. And for a lot of people, that is manageable within the constraints of their lives. Clarion and Clarion West are 6 weeks, and there are very few people who can afford to take 6 weeks off of their lives. That said, sometimes the timing just sort of works out for you where you can kind of take 6 weeks off. For example, I had just started a new academic position, which meant that I happened to have the summer free where I didn't have to work. There were other people in my cohort who were in the process of moving, transitioning from one place to another, and I think this was just a good time for them. Other people simply made the sacrifice, but still, I'm not going to sugarcoat it. It is a big con, not con as in a scam, but it's a big issue that it's so expensive and takes up so much time. Another con, I would say, is potentially that this format might not work for all kinds of writers. In fact, I'm sure it doesn't work for all writers because we're all different. It happened to work pretty well for me and for many other people, but it's not a universal experience. I am sure that there were people who went to Clarion and thought, oh my God, what am I doing here? This isn't what I need. This isn't what I want. It's not helping me. Having some amount of self-awareness about what kind of writer you are and what sorts of processes work for you before you spend the resources and time and money and energy to go to one of these is a good idea. Because the last thing you want is to show up and then just have it be a failure when you could have spent that time, money, and energy in another way, in another process that actually would have helped you. Those are two pretty big cons, and I'm going to go ahead and move on to the benefits. The first, surprising, and probably the most valuable benefit that I got out of Clarion is that I learned to develop my own critical reading skills. It's not like I didn't know how to read before, and it's certainly not like I didn't know how to read critically before. I had been in a history PhD program, and that's all about critical reading of history texts, though. But what I mean is that when you're critiquing every day, and we would have workshop every day, that's how it worked, is we would critique 3 stories of our classmates every day. You start to develop your internal sense of, oh, this is how I respond to a story. Oh, this is what I value in a story. Oh, these are the things that I notice. These are the strengths of my critical eye. These are the things that I didn't notice until other people pointed them out. That's interesting. So it was actually most valuable for me as a laboratory for self-reflection and for developing my own sense of who I am as a writer and as a reader. And for me, those are linked. The person that I am as a reader and the person I am as a writer are very linked together inextricably. That was amazing. I was able to articulate these responses and these emotional reactions that until Clarion had been a little bit vague and instinctive, and thoughts and feelings that I was aware of but didn't know how to express and didn't really understand where they came from in terms of what techniques, what craft elements was I responding to that made me have that. But being forced to explain for the benefit of your friend, your colleague, your classmate who wrote the story, you can't just say, yeah, I didn't really connect to this character. At Clarion, you have to say, yeah, I didn't connect to this character, and I wonder if it's because ... And you have to really analyze your own responses. So I would say that was really valuable. And honestly, it was more valuable than getting 17 critiques of my own stories. I mean, that's great and wonderful, and I learned a ton from my classmates, but I actually learned more from how they read everyone else's stories as well as my own, if that makes sense. The second big benefit is obviously the cohort, getting to meet your team, your tribe. I'm friends with many of them to this day. We meet up virtually, we still exchange stories. It's really wonderful. It's like having people who kind of get what you're trying to do because they've read so much of your work after 6 weeks. They've heard your critiques after 6 weeks, so they kind of know who you are and what's important to you. And they're there to support you. And you start learning, you start really internalizing that we are all in this together. And I think for me at least, that was a big lesson that Clarion taught me. We are all in this together. And the third wonderful benefit is obviously the instructors and the quality of the instructors. I don't necessarily think Clarion is amazing for networking. because you don't meet that many people. You just have these intense, concentrated moments with certain instructors. If you hit it off with an instructor, then they might become your mentor and you might continue to work with them and so on. I'm sure that's happened with some people, and I know that's happened with a couple people who I know personally. For me, it was more like I got a chance to hear what someone I respect said about every story that was submitted that week, which is a lot of stories, and hear them talk about other things too, because we would often have dinner with our instructors, we would often go for a walk with our instructors, so we would kind of get a sense of who they are, what brought them to writing, and what their writing process is, and how they read, and how they value stories, and so on. Now, there are some tangible, practical network effects as well. For example, one of our instructors at Clarion was Charlie Finley. He used to be the editor-in-chief of the magazine of fantasy and science fiction. And so when I submitted to SFN, oh God, I always get that wrong. When I submitted to F&SF, I would say, "Hi, Charlie, here's my story," right? He still, rejected me, but it was a very kind rejection at least. But he's kind to everybody. But it makes you feel, I guess, in general, less intimidated about submitting to editors because you've had one editor as an instructor and you realize, oh, they're human and they like what they like and that's okay, and they're not some strange, faceless, different breed of human who is an editor. Does that make sense? They're just humans. There's more I could say about this, but in the interest of keeping this video relatively short and compact, I'm going to move on. So here are the 10 questions you should ask yourself before applying to a residency writing workshop. Number 1, why do you want to go? I think it's worth spending a little bit of time really thinking about this. What is it that you are looking for? And is it something that the workshop can actually provide? Given that these workshops, as we mentioned, are extremely expensive and take up time and energy, I would suggest that you balance what you get out of a workshop or what you think you want out of the workshop with that cost to you. Of course, it's impossible to know 100%, but the more clearly you can answer that question for yourself, the more able you will be to make that decision. Is that grammatically correct? You'll be able to make that decision better. And honestly, there's no right or wrong answer here, right? It's all subjective. If you say, hey, I want to go because I just think it would be fun, and you have the money to spend and the time to spend, go for it. Number 2 is sort of related, but a little bit more specific. What are you hoping to get out of the workshop experience? You may not be able to answer this question because maybe you're like, well, I don't know because I haven't been to one of these before. But at least exploring what you hope to get out of it will help you decide which of these programs to apply to. Again, it comes down to things like flavor, tone, structure, and what the emphasis is. Number 3, if you don't get in, are there other things you can do to progress towards your writing goals? And I think this is a great question because chances are, statistically speaking, you won't get in. And it's a bummer to feel like, oh no, I had put all my eggs in that basket. I was hoping that that would be the thing that would level me up as a writer or whatever. But if you have alternatives, if you're like, well, that didn't work out, but if you have alternatives, then I think it mutes the bummeriness of that rejection and also keeps you moving on a path that you want to be on. And honestly, you don't need these workshops to get better as a writer. It's just one path. So exploring other paths, I think, is always valuable. Number 4, and this is probably the first question that you ask naturally, can you afford it, both in terms of time and money? And again, if not, are there other things you can do to progress towards your writing goals? And I'll bet there are. Number 5, what else is going on in your life right now? Are there things that demand your attention? Are there things that you can let go for some amount of time? Are there people who can pick up some of the things that you'll have to drop if you decide to go? Do you have support? Is your life really complicated and busy and full of things? Are you maybe applying because you want to run away? By the way, that's a totally valid reason to to apply and go. Just understand what it is that you're doing. Self-awareness is always good. Number 6, are you ready for intensive critique? Because many of these workshops are founded on intensive critique. Now, the critique doesn't even have to be particularly rough or unkind. It's just constant. And on some level, after a couple of weeks, you definitely get used to it. But it is always a bit of a drain to prepare something new every week and then submit it to 18 other people to dissect, even if they're kind. So ask yourself, are you ready for that? And maybe you don't know, and that's okay. Number 7, related to number 6, is are you ready for intensive work? Because that's the other thing about these workshops is they are a ton of work. Not only are you working on your own story, but you're reading 3 stories a day. And not only are you reading 3 stories a day, you are also providing in-depth, thoughtful, analytical critique on them. Add to that the time spent in classroom instruction, in workshop, and all these other things that are going on. Other meetings, lectures, visiting guests, other writers, and social events. It can be a lot. And for 6 weeks, that's a lot of activity to sustain. Some people are more resilient for that kind of work. Ask yourself if you're ready for it. And if you're not, how can you get ready for it if you still want to go? Number 8, are you ready for a roller coaster of emotions? This is kind of an unfair question because no one's ready for a roller coaster of emotions. But just be aware that that is something that you may experience at a workshop like this. Because of the intensity of the work, because of the intensity of seeing the same people over and over again for pretty long periods of time, people who used to be total strangers, and then all of a sudden you're seeing them every day for hours at a time, it can lead to some intense feelings. It is not uncommon for people to have breakdowns. It is not uncommon for people to have fights. It isn't uncommon for people to cry, have sort of emotional outbursts. It's just, it's sort of a stressful time and people respond to it differently. So just know that going in and do what you can to prepare yourself for that and really ask yourself, are you ready to have things like that going on for however long they'll go on for? Number 9, are you ready to support other writers through their journey without judgment or jealousy? I think all of us hope that the answer to this is absolutely yes, I am. But be honest with yourself. And again, I'm not saying if the answer is I don't know that you shouldn't go. I'm just saying really think about it because that is one of the expectations of attending a workshop like this. It is not a requirement, of course. You don't have to provide unfailing support, but it's definitely an expectation of other attendees and the culture and the instructors that you're going to be supportive. And I think most of us try our best to be supportive, but sometimes being supportive means giving a little bit more than we can handle of ourselves, if that makes sense. I'm being super real here. I don't think anyone sets out to be a bad, unsupportive person. I'm just saying that support sometimes takes emotional energy, and we don't always have that store of emotional energy. We don't always have that resource to be supportive to others. And again, I'm not saying that you 100% have to be. You can certainly go to Clarion and pick and choose the times that you're going to be supportive. And that's the other thing too, is learning to put some boundaries around yourself and your ability to provide support. Because in an environment like Clarion, you can give of yourself all day long, and that's not healthy either. Actually, that should have been a question. That's a bonus question. Let's say that's bonus 9B. The question, are you ready to put some boundaries around your ability to emotionally support other people? Hi, this is Editing Jane, and I realized that in that whole discussion about support and providing emotional support, which I think is really important, obviously, there's something else that we need to talk about, and this is getting real again. And it's a little uncomfortable for me to talk about because these are feelings that a lot of us don't feel we should have. But I guess another question that you should ask yourself before applying to a workshop like this is your self-confidence stable enough to be able to withstand the bouts of imposter syndrome and insecurity that you might experience when you're in the same room with 17 other amazing, wonderful, fantastic, and very, very different from you writers. And some of them will be much more accomplished, whatever that means to you, than you are. And it may be very tempting and perhaps very natural to measure yourself against their accomplishments. They may already have had stories published when you do not. They may already have an agent that you do not. They may already have finished a novel. They may be shopping it around. They may have graduated from an MFA program that you did not. They may just be a brilliant writer that you wish you could be like. All of these things are totally natural and they are going to happen. And I think sometimes we're in a place where we're able to deal with that and still be okay and still keep writing and exploring our own voice and putting it out there. And other times we're in a more fragile state where that becomes really, really hard to do. And we end up feeling very anxious and depressed, and that imposter syndrome grows. So that's just something to be aware of, I guess, and think about. And I don't know how to prepare yourself for that exactly. Maybe that's for another video. Maybe I'll think about how I do that, or the kinds of things that I do to try to mitigate those feelings. Anyway. And finally, number 10, do you have emotional support available to you outside of the workshop? Do you have friends, family, a community that you can maybe reach out to when the workshop becomes a little overwhelming, or when you just need a break from workshopping? Because I think that could be really helpful too. Again, not necessary at all. Not everyone needs that kind of thing, but it's just something to ask yourself. And if you feel like you don't right now, can you cultivate that before you actually attend the workshop? Can you tell your friends and family what you're doing and ask them for what you need while you're there? Okay, I think that is it. I hope that these 10 questions to ask yourself before applying to a residency writing workshop was helpful for you. If you have other questions or anything you'd like to add, maybe I've forgotten to address something. If you have any questions or anything you would like to add, or maybe I forgot to address something, please let me know, and happy writing.